Thank you again for joining us for this episode of the Real Estate Mentor Podcast, the #1 real estate mentorship podcast on the internet. I am your host, Jonathan Klunk, and we are honored today to have Danaus Chang with us. He is the co-founder and president at Awning, and Awning is a short-term rental and long-term rental technology company that helps investors to locate and manage their properties. And they guarantee real estate investing made easy at Awning. Danaus, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I wanted to begin with your background. I think that you have a very interesting start to life that really helped to propel your interest and your knowledge about real estate, investing and property management through your parents. Could you tell us how you got started and how your parents got started in the business?
Yeah, it goes back to my early days living in Dallas, Fort Worth, specifically Fort Worth. My father and mom immigrated here, Chinese heritage, ended up coming to the United States many decades ago. And basically, they had humble beginnings, started out here. My dad was a teacher. My mom worked multiple jobs at a daycare, working in factories, all sorts of different things. And they saved up as much money as they could. And living the American dream was owning real estate and owning a property. And so they purchased their first property. I think their property at the time, many decades ago, was maybe around $30,000, but that was a lot of money back then. And they purchased that property. I think this was right before maybe well before I was born, but basically purchased that property. They were proud of themselves. They lived there. And then I think it was maybe a couple of years down the line, they saw another property that was a little bit bigger. And I think my two sisters were born and they needed a bigger house. And so they wanted to purchase this property. They saved up for that. And their option was to sell their other property or actually keep it and actually collect the rent. So they decided to go that path. They thought, this was a way to get some extra income. So in doing so, that was their first rental property that they had. And a lot of people call that term accidental landlord. I think in this case, it wasn't necessarily accidental. It was done with purpose, with the goal of, potentially owning more properties. But I think at the time they didn't realize that was going to be the first of many properties that they were going to own. So they started doing that. And then it started repeating itself. And then I was born. I grew up around all of that. It was very common for me to be living in a house and then a few years down the line, move to the next. So they started doing this version of house hacking where they were purchasing these properties, ended up getting some primary mortgages, conventional mortgages, and then with those, buying that property, living in it for a couple of years, and then moving to another property and keeping that other one and renting it out. And I grew up, mainly basic normal childhood, but the difference was I grew up during the weekends and even evenings going with my dad or even going with my mom to sometimes collect rent or even mowing the lawns. And it wasn't necessarily just mowing our lawns. I remember living in one of our houses and it didn't even have a lawn. It had rocks. And my friends were like, wait, you're going to go mow a lawn? What lawn are you mowing? I'm like, oh, this other house. And my parents are also very private, so they never wanted me to explain everything. And they're just like, oh, I'm just mowing this other house. And they're like, oh, you got this side business. It's like, well, I'm basically helping my parents and such. So I grew up around real estate, managing properties. I could say I've managed properties for many decades, but
Right.
not really. It was more of just kind of helping them out. And so
Helping out.
I
love how they got their start. That is such a great way for people to get started in real estate. If you're living in a starter home, let's say like a 3-bedroom, 1-bath at an affordable price, and you want to upgrade into a new house, especially if you have a low interest rate because you refinanced or purchased when interest rates were in the 2 and 3%. If you speak to your lender and you qualify to purchase another house without having to sell your other residence, that is an excellent way for people to get started growing their real estate portfolio slowly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was one of those lessons that I learned and just kind of saw through observation. It wasn't this like formal mentorship and let's pass this down. It was just, okay, I see what you're doing there. That's pretty interesting. And although it was hard work, it started to become easier. And I started to see this path to passive income without really even knowing what passive income meant. And because my parents kept full-time jobs, my mom ended up running a daycare. My dad continued his education career for, I don't know, almost 40 years or so.
That's
And
amazing. So
all
they
while on
had
the side.
several sources of income. They were able to work their full-time jobs and supplement that with kind of this semi-passive income. Obviously, if you're doing any type of work at all, it's not purely passive, but they have the kids to help, and there are a lot of tax benefits in that as well. Some of the tax strategies talk about bringing your kids onto the payroll, paying them a little bit. And so they create some tax deductions when, you might not otherwise be able to get another job because of your age. You can start that early and actually have additional tax savings. But this story is very remarkable, especially with your parents being immigrants to the United States. How can you tell us kind of the expanse of their portfolio? How long did they do this, and how many properties did they acquire?
I think that they did it. I mean, my parents right now are in their 80s, but I would say, I mean, the last 40 some odd years, maybe 50 some odd years, depending on where you consider the very first one, they've been investing in properties. And for a while, they were buying at least a property a year or so.
Wow.
And then they kind of stopped when they were getting a little bit older. But you know what? They're still managing and operating these properties right now. And so, yeah,
That's
they
amazing.
have dozens of single family properties throughout Dallas Fort Worth.
Well, I love to hear those stories. And so all of this, rubbed off on you. You mentioned it wasn't truly a formal mentorship program, but just being around that, being immersed in the business, probably being forced to help out sometimes, had an impact and made an impression on you. I'm sure that you carried forward into your college and early adult years.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I went to University of Texas at Austin, studied finance, had these aspirations when you're in finance at the time to go be in management consulting or be an investment banker. I went the management consulting route. I'll tell a little bit more about how my career has had some, twists and turns and such. But, I had the opportunity to actually be able to stay in Austin, and Austin's always been cool, but this was before it became really hot, as of lately. But I graduated. A couple of buddies and I moved into an apartment, and an apartment living was just like my first chance to go have a few different roommates. And right as soon as I moved into that apartment, it was funny because my mom was like basically saying, "Okay, it looks like you're going to stay in Austin a little bit. When are you going to buy your first house?" And I hadn't even thought about it. I was just trying to think about getting a job first. And I got that job, and it's like, okay, you got a job. You've shown that, you're going to probably stay in Austin a little bit. Why don't you go buy that house and start planning for that? So while living in that apartment, I went through the mortgage approval process. I wasn't making that much money coming straight out of college, but basically I did end up getting approved, and I started doing some house shopping. And at first I was looking at some smaller 2-bedroom types of houses and even condos. But again, kind of thinking about my parents, they started explaining a little bit more of saying, well, why don't you buy a few more, or essentially get something with more bedrooms? It'll be easier to rent out to families in the future if you end up making a rental property. But even better, if you have any roommates, that are willing to pay rent, then that can really
Right.
help with your mortgage. So ended up finding a great property. It was a little more north, so I got some good value out of that. And I had my great buddy roommates that I'm still friends with today. And they were like, yeah, I'm in. Let's all live together in this fun house. So we did that, and essentially this was a win-win situation. We all got to live together, and they got a decent deal on their rent. I think they were paying like $400 a month or so for their rooms. This was some years ago, so I think
Right.
today it's like 4 times as much as that, if not more, per room if you were to split that up. And I essentially got some of my mortgage subsidized. And to me, it didn't feel like I was ripping anybody off because they got a win. I put a big down payment based on some savings and even a little bit of a forgivable loan, I'll call it, from my parents to help me with the seed to pay for that property. And they essentially ended up moving in, and then that was my first ownership. I think I was like 22 years old or so, and it worked out out really great. I ended up actually needing to move and got a job in the Bay Area. And then suddenly it became a true rental property. And so I ended up getting a manager to help me manage that property. But that was the beginning right there.
Well, good for your parents for encouraging all of that and walking you through that process a little bit. I think that parents who are interested in real estate investing today, many of them do share a lot of the principles and everything that goes into that type of business with their kids at an early age. But I think that this is a great testament and story of, exactly how that can pay off whenever you start them early. And even if they do know it, sometimes they still need a little bit of encouragement to do the right thing and to get started as early as possible, because appreciation on real estate and the time value of money, the earlier you get started, the more that's going to pay off in the long run. So now you're in the Bay Area, you have one property under your belt. I'm sure that you've grown that over time. You've stayed involved in the real estate world. Obviously, your consulting and technology backgrounds have bled over into some startups that you've been involved in, including Awning, that we mentioned at the beginning of the show, and you can tell us a little bit about later. So one thing that you mentioned to me was, and this was new information for me because I don't stay plugged into all of the new ideas and concepts in individual real estate investing, but it's the FIRE movement. And I'm really kind of fascinated by this, and I'd like for our audience to hear it. Can you tell us about what the FIRE movement is, how you're applying that to your business, and what that's done for you?
Yeah, I think it's one of those fun things to think about from an aspirational standpoint. Something I thought about, I don't know, I might have got into it maybe 8 years ago, something like that, where I saw a Reddit thread and then suddenly heard a few different podcasts. But essentially, the acronym FIRE, F-I-R-E, stands for Financially Independent, Retire Early. And for a while, I was working and grinding in one of my first kind of tech jobs or first leadership jobs in tech. And it was really, really tough and working more hours than potentially even more hours than a lot of the traditional investment banking jobs and such. And at that point, you're doing it because it's fun, but you're doing it because, you're looking for a reward to happen later down the line. And one of the things that kept me going was thinking about this idea that all this hard work is going to pay off, and I'll start to be able to think about other opportunities that essentially wouldn't require money or income necessarily as the main driver. And that could be like anything, something to do with a really passionate hobby. And I just started like daydreaming about what that looked like, and then saw that there's an actual culture around that. And that's that FIRE movement. So started reading up a lot about it. And all it really was, when I found out, was essentially just if you're into personal finance, this was a more, I guess, it's a culture around that, where you have different people kind of supporting you and coming up with ideas of how do you make passive income, and how do you essentially get the most return with the least input associated with that. And some people started thinking about this as, hey, can I do this? Can I work really, really hard for the first 10 years of my life and then kind of coast the rest? And I started finding out that there's all these different groups within that kind of mindset. And some of it is modified versions of FIRE, where there's lean FIRE. And that's essentially, can I live the leanest amount and essentially have my cost be very, very low, and work really hard to get some level of passive income or income coming in that I can pull from to help cover those costs. And then on the other spectrum, you've got this whole other cultural movement called fat FIRE. And you're like, what does that exactly mean? And it basically means, hey, I'd like to live a fat life. And what would it look like? And what would it require from the passive income standpoint, or just, light, modified passive or something like that, that can give you enough income to help support a fat life. And so there's even like Reddit forums that are called Fat Fire that talk about people saying, my spend right now is 300,000, 400,000 a year. What is it going to take for me to be able to afford that and not have to work full time? And so there's a whole cultural movement around that as well. And so I'm kind of fascinated with all aspects of that.
Yeah, I love the concepts of that. You have lean FIRE, which is essentially living a very Spartan existence. trying not to spend, recycle as much as possible, and put everything that you earn that you don't need back into your investments. And then on the other end of the scale, you have the people who don't want to sacrifice or make those sacrifices, continue living their best life while still accomplishing the same thing. So one obviously requires a lot more resources than the other. And it sounds like there are other things involved besides just real estate, probably different forms of investing. Is that the case? Can people go many different directions with real estate just being one piece of this, or is it primarily real estate focused?
Yeah, so for me, because I'm heavily on the real estate side, real estate's heavy for my side. So I think a little bit more about what type of income my real estate can end up getting me post expenses, and then essentially what does that cover relative to my cost. But another way to think about this is what they term as more of like a safe withdrawal rate. So if you think about inflation happening and things like that, you've got a few things against you. But if you were to look at, in general, the S&P 500 and its relationship with just kind of fixed income opportunities, the safe withdrawal rate, it kind of varies with different people. It's somewhere between 3 to 4% or so. Some people might say, hey, aggressively, or if you're kind of looking at a bull run era, with stocks and such, it's actually much higher. But if you were to do something that's safe, 3 to 4% is what you would kind of expect, where you could essentially keep withdrawing from it and essentially, not depleting it for many, many decades or so. So that's why some people often, start to think about $1 million. If I have $1 million worth of stock or so, if I were to safely withdraw 3 to 4% of that per year, that's how much cost it can help offset. And then if that's the ratio, then you're kind of set and you don't necessarily have to work. And of course there's going to be ups and downs and so, but that's why I'm talking about for the fat fire people who have higher incomes or higher expenses. They're thinking about, how can I get to $8 million or so and $7 million of kind of net worth, and be able to withdraw from that. So that's one aspect of it. I think mine is a little bit of a blend. I'm very heavily on real estate, and real estate comes with some different advantages, as you already mentioned, because I spend, and don't quote me on this, not a CPA and such, but over 750 hours a year in real estate, and that's over 50% of my working time in that area. I'm able to take some additional deductions and such, and so against my income. And so with that, real estate's actually a bigger opportunity for me than just kind of the stock appreciation and right. Withdrawals from that. So I've gone heavier. But I think, again, the biggest concept of this FIRE movement is, how can I make a certain amount of either income or be able to pull from my savings to help cover that cost, and do so without having to work 80 hours, that's exaggerated, but kind of not in my world that I
right. Yeah.
How do I not work 50 hours a week? And
it's definitely a great concept, and things that we should be thinking about. I think that traditional retirements in large part might be going away in the coming decades. Pensions, I don't think that we see those as much anymore. Employer contributions to 401ks, IRAs, things of that nature. We very well, in Social Security even, I think that there are lots of conversations about, is that going to exist when we reach retirement age or our kids reach retirement age? So great conversation to have, to understand how much that you need to have in order to live the life that you want, whether you want to retire early or even just at your retirement age itself. And of course, as you start to grow that empire of real estate being a lot more predictable than the stock market, a little bit more steady whenever you're talking about expenses in, expenses out, you have fixed costs. It's not going up and down like the stock market can. I think that, I want to continue to harp on the importance of having a proper tax strategy, because that can, as you grow your empire, save you hundreds of thousands of dollars, and some people millions, over the course of owning this real estate that they're not paying in federal taxes, by having it correctly structured, not just individual properties and individual LLCs. That provides you with liability protection, but you're still paying some of the highest tax rates to the federal government from things like that. So being intelligent about how you do it, and not just doing the work, but maximizing every opportunity that you can to continue to grow that nest egg that you have that you can pull 3% from. So let's talk about goals for a second. Actionable things. I always like to leave people on this podcast with things that they can take away and possibly apply to their business starting today, next week, next month. What are maybe some of your goals that you might feel comfortable sharing with us? And how are you taking steps to achieve those? Like you said that your parents, they were purchasing one property per year. That's an excellent, straightforward, achievable goal, I think, for a lot of people. What are your goals?
Yeah, I like the simple goal that my parents, buying one property per year. I think having a goal that is very simple, and sure, there's all these what ifs. You're like, well, does that include an apartment building, or does that include this like tiny condo? And it's like, in general, if you still have this goal of making some type of purchase, what it's forcing you to do is to actually like purchase something. And then if you have excess cash, or if interest rates are lower at that point, or mortgage rates are lower, then yeah, maybe you'll buy more. But just having kind of a minimum goal, I think, is really important. I'm actually taking on that goal right now. I'm basically saying, hey, let me, I got off track a little bit on some of the real estate, been kind of heads down, and a couple of the tech ventures that I've been a part of. But
Easy to
with
do.
my own, yeah. But with awning.com, our main focus, as you mentioned before, was helping real estate investors find properties and making investing really easy by essentially matching people with different types of services. And for even a couple of years, I wasn't buying properties, and it was such a bummer because the interest rates are so low. And I think I was just somewhat distracted by building the business, that I wasn't drinking my own Kool-Aid. And at some moment I was like, wait, what am I doing here? Let me actually leverage the tools and the resources I have to go purchase some properties. And ended up during COVID, coming back to the roots. I split time in the Bay Area and Dallas Fort Worth now. And we were in Dallas Fort Worth, and I got a 4-year-old at the time. He was, 2 years old or so. And I used our own technology to help identify and find a certain property in this area that had a brand new school that was getting a lot of like attention in the Fort Worth area. And I learned about that. And I used our own technology to help identify a low cost, a lower priced, but higher upcoming value type of property in this one area that's right on the border of the school district. And I ended up purchasing that. And I was like, okay, great. I have this right now. This can cash flow, but it could probably appreciate. Great. So that was like kicking me back into the game a little bit. And I identified another property that I'm about to get under contract in the next year or so. So I'm actually following the old school simple thought that my parents had of, let me try to buy one property per year. So that's getting me into that. The other thing from a goal perspective right now is, it is taking a little bit from this FIRE movement, is I've got sort of my own goals around what that kind of total passive income I'm looking for. And that's a mix of a safe withdrawal rate with the actual income that can come from real estate. My formula is a little bit complicated, and I'm still trying to work on the model associated with that. But I'm also trying to be realistic and be very accurate. So I'm even trying to build in tax savings associated with that, so I can be a little more accurate. But I've got my own goals there that are requiring me to either cut some expenses or increase that passive income that comes out of that. And so if you can kind of understand what your current spend is now and sort of project what that spend will be. So for example, if you have kids and they're about to enter college, or essentially you're going to become an empty nester, then you can potentially start to reduce your projected expenses. And then from there, take that baseline and start to see, okay, how much do I need to make? And then you can kind of work your way backwards to see, here's how much I need to save up, and here's how much, if I'm going to purchase real estate, how much income I'm going to need from that. And then start to build out your strategy. And so that's kind of the top-down type of methodology that I start with, and mix that up with my, one property of the year. And then in the end of the day, it kind of meets together. I've got some goals associated with that. And one thing I did want to mention about all of this is me being an entrepreneur, and any entrepreneur will tell you out there, this is not just about making money. You have to have the passion to do this, and you have to actually just like have the drive and want to build something, and it's fun.
Or you'll burn
You're
out.
an entrepreneur yourself, and I think you understand that absolutely.
Yes.
And so For me, it's not actually even the FIRE movement. It's the FI movement for me. So it's more of financially independent. And
Yes.
because I don't see myself retiring early. And my parents, they manage all their houses, which is wild. My dad's 87 years old, and he
Good
goes
for
and checks
them.
out a house on the weekends. But it keeps them young. And my mom's, this is her passion. And she's running a machine right now, and she's 80. And I see myself kind of doing something like that, but mine's going to be a little bit more modified. We'll probably hit up the beach and do some vacations more than my parents do. But
Absolutely.
yeah, so I'd say those are kind of the two things. Understand your number that you need to get to and how you're going to get there, and then give yourself a very simple goal of being able to meet that number.
I love your analytical, methodical approach to it with a very defined goal. Goals are important to have because, if we don't have them, then why are we working? Why are we making money? I want to have $1 million in the bank and then I'll be happier. Okay, great. Now, what are you going to do with that money? Go on vacations or buy a new house? I think so many of us operate without the end goal in sight. We just, grind all day and all night to try and succeed as much as possible, whatever that looks like to us. And when we don't have that focus, but we do have the drive, I think that's when that can certainly lead to burnout, especially if you lack some of the passion, like you mentioned as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Danaus, and we appreciate having you. Do you want to give a plug for Awning? Let our audience know who your services are for, how they can engage with you, and what you can do for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So awning.com, it's awning.com, like an awning. You can go to check that out. We specifically help individual retail real estate investors. So people like myself, people like my parents, help them identify and find properties, and then also match them to really great resources and services. That's anything from finding a real estate agent to work with that focus on real estate investments in general, all the way to helping to estimate how much revenue you might get for your short-term rental or even long-term rental, and then even matching you up with really great property management services. So lots of different opportunities there. If you were to check out, again, awning.com, awning.com, you should be able to find something that will be able to help you.
A valuable time-saving resource in today's world that is very much needed if you're going to grow at scale. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, I'm Jonathan Klunk, host of the Real Estate Mentor. If you like this episode, please give us a 5-star review so more people will see us, hear us, and be able to apply these principles to their lives and amass a nice fortune through real estate investing. Thank you very much. Tune in next time.